This evening's roundtable is a follow-up to the discussions of January 29th over the question of war or peace in Iraq. Indeed, the war is now 2 weeks old, and the subject of this evening's roundtable is not whether the war will take place or not. The subject is the paradox of military power.
Night a distinction between hard power on one hand and soft power on the other help us shedding some light on what's happening. The leadership of one country is no longer measured on its military potential, but rather in its capacity to represent ideals and goals which are looked up by others and shared, to exercise moral authority, to stand up for a good cause, to appeal to transnational civil societies. First, military power and economic pressure do not automatically make you any stronger politically if they are not backed up by persuasive policy, coherently developed and consistently pursued. Second point, military power, and this is perhaps the most remarkable paradox, does not help you win the war. This statement must be qualified, of course. Overwhelming military power and sophisticated military technology make you win the war in the battlefield eventually, but not necessarily as easily and costless as you would expect. Finally, excessive focus and reliance on military force makes one overlook other forms of power which could be used to achieve the desired results. The use of force in the fight against terrorism and state sponsor of terrorism by the United States has quickly dissolved the unanimous consent that existed in the aftermath of September 11th attacks. Power is a much more subtle notion than it seems, and law, which reflects the societal context from which it emanates and which it aims to regulate, is no less complex social phenomenon. Ultimately, there is no paradox at all inherent in the expression military power. The rather simplistic view that what power is all about is force, and that military strength is power in its purest form, doesn't hold true anymore. Military power is just one form of power, arguably not even the less important one, at a time of mutual interdependence among states. Yet again, the reality of international as well as human relations shows that the need for, shall I say, subtlety is an imperative to anyone who wants to exercise power.
It seemed to me that there is one paradox, which is that international law seems irrelevant and at the same time more and more relevant. I have been in the United Kingdom for the last few days, and I have been amazed, as I think many of you were over the last week, at the way in which the United States has been insisting on the application of the Geneva Conventions, in particular with regards to prisoners of war. And if there is one small consolation from this war, it is that Donald Rumsfeld has found his copy of the Geneva Conventions. There's a paradox again in that when the United Kingdom and the United States are talking about the Geneva Conventions in this context, they seem to only believe it applies to the other side. They are totally outraged that United States nationals or British nationals are shown on Iraqi TV. But British television, the BBC and CNN, continued to show those newspapers at the same time that the other side was being denounced as war criminals. Now, I found that a paradox, and I found it rather strange. Now, I have to say that the Swiss Foreign Minister, Micheline Camry-Ray, did ask the Swiss TV to stop showing those pictures in order to bring Switzerland into conformity with the Geneva Conventions. I am pleased in one way that we have rediscovered some of the laws of war, and I think we are at the beginning of a sense by the United States and the United Kingdom that these things are worthwhile, they are adapted to modern conflict, and all the rejections that we heard around Guantanamo, I think, will be rethought. In fact, I even read today that they are thinking of taking some of the Iraqi detainees to Guantanamo. Some of the crimes which were rejected by the United States and others at the Rome Conference are now undoubtedly war crimes when they are being committed by the other side. I've just noted three. First of all, the issue of the TV pictures, I've already mentioned that. But secondly, those responsible for environmental damage will be tried as war criminals. That was a specific crime that was rejected by the United States as not a customary international law crime. And now it is being reintroduced as criminal. And lastly, the use of weapons of mass destruction. Anyone who uses weapons of mass destruction will be tried as a war criminal. And yet it was impossible to include the sorts of weapons, such as nuclear weapons or other weapons of mass destruction, in the Rome Statute, precisely because this was not to be governed by the laws of war. So maybe you weren't expecting such an optimistic intervention from me, but I do think that there is a chance now to see greater clarity in what are war crimes and what are the laws of war. On the other hand, I think there is a resurgence in the interest in applying international humanitarian law by the letter, and we should be careful that it is not used and abused for strategic ends and propaganda means, rather than for the purpose for which it is designed, which is the protection of the human dignity of the individual. Thank you.
The first thing we need to recognize is this has turned out to be a real war, despite the best wishes of the Pentagon and some of the other civilian leaders in the US government who were over-optimistic and publicly so about the course that this war would take. Now, I think here, this is a serious intelligence or policy failure on the part of the US administration, because you only had to read statements by Iraqi officials and know a little bit about Iraqi politics to understand what their military strategy would be, which suffers from at least two weaknesses that we can already identify. The first is an excessive faith in the role of technology to win battles, and especially in the ability of strategic bombing, shock and awe, to win wars, or at least to make ground war painless or even unnecessary. And we know this too from as far back as World War II, that strategic bombing does not win wars, because no matter how good your command and control and how good your night vision equipment and so forth, a well-dug-in enemy fighting on his own territory has several advantages that are already difficult to overcome. The second weakness in strategic thought here, I think, is that tendency to personify the enemy, in this case Saddam Hussein and his sons. We saw this at the very outset of the war with the belief that a so-called decapitation strike that took out the leadership might even prevent the war from happening. Well, this rests on an overestimation of how fragile ruling elites are, and in the case of Iraq, I think it failed to recognize that there is an entire leadership cadre, several thousands, if not tens of thousands of people in the Ba'ath Party, the police, the various Mukhabarat intelligence services, the armed forces, the Tikriti clan, and so on. And these people are an integral part of this regime. They are loyal to it. They don't flinch at using intimidation, force, violence, and terror. They've been doing it for some time. And for these loyalists, you either fight to keep power or you have nothing, and you are often dead. Now, this should not really surprise us. Saddam Hussein is a survivor. His definition of victory for the past 20 years has not been winning. He's lost every war he's fought. But he has survived through more than 20 years of war and sanction. And I think this lesson was not terribly well absorbed by the people who were promoting a rapid strike and perhaps promising an early victory. The American commitment to multilateralism, to international institutions, and even perhaps, I think, to international law, as Andrew Clapham has highlighted, has always been much more instrumental and has always been much more willing to measure this commitment against national interest, and much less likely to believe that law and institutions are building blocks and cornerstones of world order. This leads me to my third point, which is that the political divide that we see looming between the United States and the rest is no longer the West versus the rest, but it's a division among so-called Western allies. Now, it's easy to be critical of U.S. policy, and I share most, if not all, of the criticisms. I do think we need to spend a bit of time understanding what motivates American policymakers to choose the unilateral and indeed military route.
Let me make a few quick points. The first one is, it needs to be underlined once more that this is a war without a Security Council resolution. Hence, it is a war outside the established system of collective security that will have repercussions in the longer term, and that is an important aspect. Secondly, there can be no doubt that Iraq and probably the world would be much better off without Saddam Hussein. That is not the issue we are discussing. Now, two key points for the military situation. Point one is the United States will win. There is no doubt doubting the US determination to go after Saddam Hussein's kin. It is just inconceivable to me that President Bush will stand for re-election with Saddam Hussein still in Baghdad. The second point is, however, that victory will have a price tag attached to it. and it will be a price tag much higher than anybody, and particularly all the planners of the war in Washington had imagined. This military plan has failed. The plan was essentially 3 points. First, to rush the Iraqi defenses through a simultaneous air and ground campaign, not 39 days of bombardment, just go in, surprise everybody, have the troops encircled before anybody could react. To overwhelm, secondly, all resistance through the combination of firepower, agility, early and deep penetration, shock and awe, as was already said. And thirdly, if ever possible, to decapitate the regime from the outset. First of all, this operation was launched with not enough force available. Remember that the first figures that were given was to start the war with 50,000. Now we were with 300,000, and it proves that it's still not enough. Why are there not enough troops? Because, as Keith has already said, there was a blind faith in the revolution in military affairs, the idea that technology could substitute for infantry. That is a little bit reminiscent of the capitalist mistake we had in the 1990s, where many companies felt that IT would replace labor force. Will the regime collapse at that point? Will there be a long siege, protracted siege, leading potentially to human catastrophe? Or will it be Black Hawk Down all over again? The Allies' fundamental weakness here, I believe, is that despite their clear military superiority, coming back to the title of the paradox, they have no answer to that question. Worse, I believe, the answer to that question is beyond their control.
Il y a 15 jours, je crois que sur un point, tout le monde, ici en tout cas, était d'accord. Cette guerre, si elle a lieu, sera brève, sera gagnée par les États-Unis. Peut-être pas brève, mais elle sera gagnée en tout cas. Et tous les problèmes, ce sera après la guerre. Avec tout ce que j'entends ce soir, je me demande si même cette croyance-là qu'on a que, effectivement, sur le plan militaire, ça va se terminer comme ça, par une victoire, qu'est-ce qui vous permet de croire qu'effectivement, ça va être comme ça, avec toutes les réserves que vous avez vous-même citées?
I think I agree with Teddy that the victory is not in question here for the United States for several reasons. First, at the end of the day, they have overwhelming military power and overwhelming financial resources. The United States alone spends more than 1/3 of the world's total military spending. So even if you think about it in those terms, there is an unequal balance. It's true, as Teddy said, that technology does not substitute for infantry, but it does guarantee that you kill a lot more of the opponent's soldiers more quickly than they kill you, and that's what's happening out there. So it will be longer because it will be a war of attrition on at least the Iraqi side. But I do think that there is no crack in the consensus within the administration that they will continue until they win. They may have to rethink their strategy, and they have already started to change it, but they're not backing away from the goal, and I don't really see how or why they would at this point.
The United States and the United Kingdom fight the war for a quick decision, ideally. They would like to have a war with as few, as the nice euphemism goes, collateral damage as possible. So they have much power, but they cannot use that power to the fullest. Saddam Hussein, as always, by the way, in most of his wars, which were military blunders, as Keith has rightly pointed out, is fighting essentially a political campaign, not a military one.
En tant que journaliste et homme de médias dans cette affaire, une fois de plus, moi j'ai le sentiment que jamais on ne sait vraiment ce qui se passe, jamais on a vraiment la bonne explication. Dans le cas de cette guerre, elle durait depuis 5 minutes, on disait tous, en une semaine c'est fini. Au 4e jour, on a tous dit c'est l'enlisement après 4 jours. Aujourd'hui, vous dites Saddam Hussein est populaire, qu'est-ce qu'on en sait? Je crois que le fin mot de cette histoire et de cette discussion, dont je vous remercie tous, c'est qu'il faut sans arrêt se remettre en question, avoir un tout petit peu d'humilité par rapport à ce qu'on peut dire à un moment donné, parce que les choses changent et il y a beaucoup de choses qu'on ne sait pas.